I did have one other announcement I wanted to make, that Brian and Spring are out of town this morning. So another pew of emptiness accounted for, but we again are appreciative of all who are here, and look forward to having some time to talk to you. I was a couple of weeks ago. It was early in the morning, and I got a phone call. I think it was about a couple weeks ago, probably a little bit less, obviously, because I spoke 2 weeks ago. But I got a phone call from Brother David Minson, and he has a deep voice usually, but in the morning it's a little bit deeper. It sounds a little bit more serious. And he said, "I'm sorry to bother you so early in the morning." He said, "But I have something of vital importance I need to speak to you about." And I kind of halfway thought sometimes that's the beginning of something sarcastic from him, and halfway thought maybe it's something serious. And then he said, he said, "Occasionally I listen to sermons other places, and I was listening to your sermon that you gave on Sunday." And I thought, "Oh, hope it's not the serious variety." But anyway, he said, "You said at some point you were going to talk about procrastination, but you said you were going to do that later." He said, "Do you realize you said you were going to procrastinate about a sermon on procrastination?" And I said, "I did hear a few chuckles in the audience, so I think some of y'all picked up on that as well." Well, since Brent had to be out of town today, I decided I will procrastinate no longer. So we're going to talk for a little bit about procrastination this morning. All right. Someday. So an expression that we use quite often from time to time, right? Someday. In a wide variety of ways, things we talk about we'll do someday. Procrastination. I want to talk a little bit about that and what that means. Merriam-Webster defines procrastinate as to put off intentionally and habitually, which can be true. To put off intentionally the doing of something that should be done. And so it is that there are a lot of things in life, we can think about this in ways that are not spiritual, things that we procrastinate doing that we just know ought to be done. I see in your faces there's probably things out there that you're thinking of that, yeah, I haven't done that. I've been talking about doing that for a long time, and you've been procrastinating because you don't want to deal with it, right? Or whatever the reasons are that are part of that. There's a lot of things that factor in that. We're going to try to get into some of that a little bit this morning. But of course, I want to talk about it in a spiritual application this morning and think about that. Now, when we think about applying the idea of procrastination spiritually, we have something that we often talk about that's kind of the paradigm idea of procrastination, right? And that is the idea of obeying the gospel, right? Because we of course end every sermon pretty much ends with an invitation, with a call to action. And so we think a lot about the idea of obeying the gospel as something that sometimes people procrastinate about. And we think about one of the poster children for procrastination in the Bible. In Acts chapter 24, the ruler by the name of Felix. And I want to take just a moment to read about that particular account. It says, "And after certain days when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, 'Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee.'" Now, in King James speak, he didn't say someday. He said, "When I have a convenient season." But what he was saying is, someday, Paul. Someday I'll call for you. I'll hear you more about this. And maybe someday I'll do something about my soul. So we think about Felix when we think about obeying the gospel. And we think about somebody like Felix who didn't make the decision to go ahead and do that. Said, "Go away for now. Someday, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you." But I do want to ask you this morning to think about a broader application. That certainly, if you haven't obeyed the gospel, and that is on your heart, I hope you'll think about not procrastinating, about that decision. You'll think about this issue from that perspective. But I think there are a lot of other areas that we can talk about spiritually that procrastination is a problem for. There are a host of things that really are things that we could talk about that are of that nature. Other examples of things that are part of our someday. And I encourage you to think about some things in your life that maybe you've said, someday I'm going to do this. Someday I'm going to read my Bible more. I'm going to make sure that I actually study my Bible. Someday I'm going to figure out what all those Old Testament prophets are about, right? I'm going to try to put all those pieces together and figure it out. Or I'm just going to make it a point to try to read my Bible, once a day and spend a little bit of time in that. Someday I'm going to do that, right? Or maybe it's someday I'm gonna go visit Sister So-and-so. Man, I know I need to get out there and see her. And someday I'm gonna do that. And we have those kind of some days. Maybe it's someday I'm gonna teach my family. I'm really busy at work right now, but there's gonna be someday when I'm gonna get this thing on track and I'm gonna teach my family the way that I know I need to. It's my responsibility to bring my children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and someday I'm going to do that. Maybe it's someday I'm going to get my prayer life together. I'm going to pray more often. I'm not going to just, plunge into the meals and not remember to give the Creator thanks for His provision for me. Someday I'm going to make sure that before I lay my head to the pillow, I'm going to pray. Someday when I'm in distress, I'm going to pray more often. Someday I'm going to start coming to church. I'm going to be amongst God's people and spend time with them. And someday, maybe I'm going to do that. Maybe I've been coming just once or so. I'm going to start coming more regularly. Someday, I'm going to invite these people to church. I've been thinking about it. Haven't quite found the right time for it. Someday, I'm going to invite them to come to church with me. Someday, I'm going to talk to my friend about his soul. I know that he doesn't have a relationship with God. I know that he hasn't taken the steps to become a Christian. Someday I'm going to talk to him about that. We're going to get that sorted out. Someday I'm going to do good for others. I know there's people who are starving out there. There's people who have all kinds of problems. And someday I'm going to make some time to deal with that. Someday I'm going to get clear of some of the financial things that I've got going on, and I'm going to start contributing more to the Lord's work. Someday, I'm going to stop doing these things that I know the Lord tells me I shouldn't do. Someday, I'm going to deal with those. Someday, I'm just going to commit my thoughts and be more purposeful about my relationship with the Lord. These are all things that are part, and I literally, we could keep listing things, but I won't, of other examples of things that maybe, there's a lot of things up here that I could say are part of my someday story of things someday I was going to do. And maybe you've got a lot more. Maybe there's specific things in your mind that you've been saying someday you're going to get to. I want you to think about those things as we think about the topic of procrastination. Just fill in the blank with what your examples of someday are. The first thing I want to tell you about a folly of procrastination is that procrastination is disobedience. We don't often think about it that way because we say, someday I'm going to do all these good things. And so we don't think about procrastination being disobedience. But I want to ask you, when you go to your child, for those of you who are adults and have children, and you say, go clean your room. And your child is sitting there engrossed in YouTube or TV or whatever, and they say, I will someday. What do you think about that? I bet you are not very happy with that answer, right? You don't think that that's being the kind of obedient child that they're supposed to be. And so you're upset about that. The reality is, I will someday means I will not now. Right? We don't think about it that way, but that's the reality of it. What we think about is, I have all the best of intentions. I am going to do these things. It's not that I'm against doing the things God wants me to do. I'm going to do them someday. So we don't think about it like disobedience. We think about it, yeah, I'm going to do all those things. But really, when we say, I will someday, we're saying, I will not now. In Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 27, Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 27, it says, withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Say not unto thy neighbor, go and come again, and tomorrow I will give, when thou hast it by thee. If someone comes to you and asks something of you, and you say, come again tomorrow, the reality is that you've got these things. The Bible says that's not the way to be. We have the ability within us to take care of that need. We need to do it. And so it is when we think about the things that God has asked us to do, we have the ability to do these things. When we tell God, go away for now, tomorrow I'll start getting to these things. That's disobedience. It's a form of rebellion. And again, we don't often think about it that way, but I think that we ought to think about it more often in this kind of lens. The one of those Old Testament prophets we're going to figure out someday is Haggai. It took a little while to find where where my commentary on Haggai is, because mine are not all ordered in order because they're just kind of here, there, and everywhere in the bookshelf. But Haggai is an Old Testament prophet that was written during a time when the people of Judah, you remember the southern kingdom, was taken captive into Babylon. And this book was written when they had come back from that time in Babylon, and they returned to Jerusalem. And one of the things God was expecting of them was to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. And here we find in the time of Haggai, the people had come back, and they weren't doing that. And so God says of them in verse 2 here, it says, "Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." So the people there were saying, someday, Lord, we're going to build this. Not yet. Time's not come. Well, the time had come, and that's what the rest of Haggai's message was. The time had come for them to get busy building the temple of God. And yet there they were saying, time's not come. And for a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, what we're telling the Lord is, time hadn't come for us to do what you want me to do, Lord. I'm going to get to that. Not today. And believe me, if there's any harshness in this, I direct this at myself. This is, if there ever was a moment of the thing that we seem to say all the time, forgive me, of we preach to ourselves, this is one of them for me. But the reality is that I think we need to be aware of is that procrastination is disobedience. In James chapter 4, in verse 17, we find a convicting passage of Scripture about what we're speaking of. James chapter 4, in verse 17 says, "Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin." All these things that are part of the someday list that I have up there, those are things that we know that we ought to do. Those are good things that we should be a part of. And when we know those good things and we don't do them, to us it is sin. And so I hope we'll think a little bit more and have that perspective about procrastination, because it is a form of rejecting what God has asked us to do when we choose not to do it and say, we'll do it another day. Another thing that's a folly about procrastination is that procrastination presumes opportunity. It presumes opportunity. We think we're going to have the opportunity to do all these things someday. And the reality is we are not promised that. In Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 1, let me get that up there for y'all. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 1. There Solomon writes, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth." And boy, I guess the longer you live, the more you have examples of that reality, right? Things that happen are just, man, how could anyone have known something like that was going to happen? We don't know. There's a lot of things that are outside of our control, a lot of circumstances that are a part of that. And so when we say, someday, Lord, I'm going to do these things, we're boasting of tomorrow. We're boasting of something that we don't know that we're going to have. Again, James, we're going to have kind of a Proverbs James things going here on these thoughts. But in James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, James chapter 4 and verse 13, James writes, "Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow, we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be in the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away." And so life is something that is fleeting, and it's something that we cannot say, tomorrow I'm going to do this. We say that a lot. Sometimes we remember to say what this passage says, and we say, Lord willing, we're going to do such and such. But a lot of times, those words just roll off and say, I'm going to do something, and we really don't know that that's going to happen because we don't know that we have tomorrow. This is a thought we hear a lot too, right? It's oftentimes part of our call to action, as part of an invitation to remind people that we don't know that we're promised another day, to remind ourselves of the brevity of life, of our own mortality. But there's another way in which procrastination is an issue, because it's not just a point about our own mortality. Yes, it is true. I don't know if I'm going to be here later today. This could be the end. I don't know. But there's other aspects about opportunity that are just not about your own mortality that can cause us to lose that opportunity. If you are saying, someday I'm going to talk to my friend about Jesus, they've got their own mortality issues, don't they? Of things that can happen to them. I just imagine you've probably got somebody that you could think of in your life that maybe was part of your someday story that's no longer with us, and that someday never came up for you. Or maybe it's even something, less dramatic than that. Maybe you think you're going to have a time to talk to your friend, but they change jobs or they move or other things. So it doesn't have to be something so dramatic. We think of something taking someone's life untimely as being something so rare, but oftentimes it's things that cause us to lose opportunity that are a little more common. Life just changes, and some of those opportunities go away. So procrastination presumes the opportunity that we don't know is there. And so when we say someday we're going to do all these things, we run a very real risk that we will lose the opportunity to avail ourselves of those opportunities and to take advantage of them and to do them. I want to talk about one last thing, and it's really the main thought that sort of spurred me to talk about this, and that is procrastinations. In spite of the fact that I thought about this a lot, I couldn't say the words. Procrastination someday never comes. Now, we may think of that in the way I've just talked about it, right? I may not be here, they may not be here, but I mean this in a different way. Because there's a lot of things that we intend to do and that we mean with all of our being that we're going to do, but someday never quite gets here, right? And I'm talking about somebody who let's just say we live 95 years old or plus, right? I'm not talking about somebody whose life's cut short. I'm talking about you can live a full life, and that someday never comes. And what made me think about this, Reese gets credit for or blame for this sermon. If you haven't seen this, I do think it's worth watching. If you are like me and you have a problem with procrastination, I think you ought to go watch this. There's a guy named Tim Urban, very entertaining, who does a TED Talk. I don't know if you know I'm not sure I completely understand what TED Talks are, but I gather they're inspirational talks of some sort. That are put together by an organization. And he does a TED Talk about inside the mind of a master procrastinator. So I hope I'm not running afoul of any copyright laws in saying this. I kind of asked Kelly about it, and she's like, aren't you the lawyer? Don't confuse things with facts. But anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about what he said. It's like I said, very entertaining, in part because it does have some revealing truths about the way my mind works. So he begins by talking about how he envisions doing a long-term project and about the hours he's going to spend on it, shown on a bar chart, and about here's how he envisions it being, and it involves kind of things being spaced out over time. He's like, and then this is what it ends up being, and it's like a bar chart with everything right at the end, right? And so he was talking about his particular thing was that he had a thesis that was due, and he's like, this is going to be a big deal. So he had all these plans to do that, and then like months turned into weeks, and then weeks turned into the last week, and then it came down to 72 hours, and he hadn't started on it. So he had to write like a 90-page thesis, and he pulled 2 all-nighters in a row to do it. So he said he's convinced that there's something in his brain that must be different. So he said, I've taken the MRI of my brain against somebody who's not a procrastinator, and here's what it is. So he shows this picture, and he says, here's a rational person's brain who doesn't procrastinate, and it shows a little stick figure behind the wheel of a ship. And he calls it the rational decision maker. And it says, I think long term, I am not a child. He's like, this is the rational person's brain. And then here's my brain. And, it has the same stick figure behind the same helm of the ship, but next to him is a monkey. And that's the instant gratification monkey. And he said, so I've got the same rational decision maker in my mind that knows about, I need to do something long term. But inside my brain, there's something called the instant gratification monkey. And so he goes on to explain that the instant gratification monkey, as he's trying to drive I'm gonna get going on these things, the instant gratification monkey grabs over to the wheel and says, no, you're not. He's like, because we need to go look at 1,200 photographs of somebody I never knew in high school on Facebook and look at that for a while. And then we're going to explore the price of socks on Amazon. And then we're going to watch an interview of Justin Bieber's mom, right? And then the next picture you see is the instant gratification monkey who's at the helm, right? So then he talks about how you enter the dark playground, because he said there's times where we need to have things that are easy and fun, and sometimes that's okay as long as there's an intersection of the rational person and the easy and fun that's okay, leisure time that we have. But then there's leisure time that we have that we really shouldn't have. We haven't earned by doing things, and he calls that the dark playground. And I can relate so much to this because it's things that you do and you know you shouldn't be doing them. And I mean, I don't mean this in the sinful kind of way, but just sort of you know that you ought to be busy working on that paper or whatever, right? That project for work, but instead you're going to do something different, and it's there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of pain that's associated with that, but you do it anyway. And so he talks about the dark playground, and he says, but what happens is, so how does this get solved? And that is, there's one other character that I'll introduce you to, which is called the panic monster. The only thing the instant gratification monkey is scared of is the panic monster, and the panic monster, though, comes around when when you're facing imminent risk of public embarrassment or loss of your job or something like that, right? So the panic monster finally comes out and scares away the instant gratification monkey, and that's what causes you to actually go ahead and do something and take care of it. So if you're like me, that little story and analogy rings so true about so many things in life, and it's very comical to listen to. But he ends his TED Talk, as you can imagine, with something a bit more serious for those of you who know what TED Talks are. And that is, he got a lot of letters from people when he was telling the story with very deep thoughts about how procrastination had impacted them in life. And he said, what I came to realize, everything that he had talked about was really things where there was a deadline. I've got to turn in the thesis paper. And those deadlines are part of what triggers the panic monster to come out and drive away the instant gratification monkey. But there are a lot of things in life for which there are no deadlines. There is no moment for the panic monster to come out. So what if there's no panic monster? What if there's nothing to cause us to actually say, I've got to tell the instant gratification monkey enough time at the helm of my ship, the rational decision maker has to come back, and we've got to get to work. And so I hope you followed all this. It makes more sense with him. My point is, when we think about spiritual things, to bring this back to something that sounds more appropriate for a church service, there's not necessarily a deadline to these things, is there? There's not a moment where someone says, turn in your paper on having gone to visit Sister so-and-so who needs to be visited, that we think of, right? Of course, we all know that there's a deadline that comes with the end of life, but that's oftentimes something that doesn't bring the panic monster out, if you will. And so what happens is a lot of life slips out of our hands, and we never deal with things. So a lot of these things that he talked about being written to him were things where people had regretted things in life that they were going to do someday. Maybe they were meaning to really become a different career, and they never quite did it, things like that. But I want you to think a little bit about these things in the concept of our spiritual matters that need to be tended to, because, again, this is a very real phenomenon that if we procrastinate, we say someday we're going to do something, we don't necessarily have some trigger like a deadline at work or the time that the test has to be done or whatever the case may be to do that. So when we do that, one of the problems is that the roots of sin become embedded within us. I want to turn back and look at Felix in Acts chapter 24, beginning in verse 26. Because after he said to Paul, go thy way for this time, when I have a more convenient season, I'll call for thee. Read a little bit more about his life. It says, he hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might lose him, wherefore he sent him for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Felix was dealing with Paul when he was imprisoned because of his faith in Christ. And he said that he wished he had had a moment where somebody would have been able to sort of give him the money to turn Paul loose. And he apparently enjoyed visiting with Paul so much that he called for him to come and to be with them. But, after 2 years of not doing the right thing, of making the right decision, it came time, someone came to him and said that they wanted to keep Paul. And so he, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, he left him there being bound. When we get involved in the sin of procrastination and the sin of things that are a part of that are a result of procrastination, those things tend to sort of take root in our lives. Something that maybe was maybe easier to deal with becomes harder to address. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22, this is kind of the thought that was being expressed in the parable of the sower. Because in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22, it says, he also that received seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches, choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. And so sin has a way of doing that, of becoming wrapped around us in such a way where we don't find our way out of it. And when we procrastinate, we don't do the right thing, we let those roots of sin become embedded. And really the point I want to leave you with is that life slips away almost without notice. I recently turned 49. I know some of you have more experience to reflect on, some of you less. But, man, it's just amazing how life can do that, how fast it can just slip through your fingers. And things that you envisioned you were going to do, you can look back on and go, wow, I mean, like it's too late to now. I'm 49 years old. I'm not ever going to run that marathon that someday I was going to run or whatever, right? And so life has a way of doing that. And in the book of Haggai, picking up on that story again, where they were saying, it's not time yet, God writes about the attitude that they have there. Haggai chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. I got to get to it. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but you have not enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there is none warm. He that earneth wages to put into a bag with holes. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. And so he was saying to them, all the things they were focused on and worried about were things that were just meaningless and were just slipping through their hands. And one of the things about procrastination is when we are involved in things that are not things we want, a lot of times it's just wasted time. And life just passes by. And he called on them in that particular day to consider their ways, and as part of that then encouraged them, which they did go on to do, to build the temple. And I want to encourage us to consider our ways, to think about what it is that we're doing and make sure that we are redeeming the time that God has given us the way that we should. The Bible calls on us to do that, to redeem the time because the days are evil. You know, I'm a little jealous of Hugh's grasp of poetry, so I decided to bring in a poem to close out the thought. I'm not going to quote it the way he can, and certainly not with the eloquence that he does, but I'll share this with you. It's from Edward Young called Night Thoughts. Be wise today, 'tis madness to defer. Next day the fatal precedent will proceed. Thus on till wisdom is pushed out of life. Procrastination is the thief of time. Year after year it steals till all are fled, and to the mercies of a moment leaves the vast concerns of an eternal scene. So procrastination is a thief of time, and it can be the kind of thief that just steals and steals and steals until, like, you know, the sands of life just sort of just slip through your hands. And once they've done that, and once they're there sitting on the ground, I can tell you there's just no way to pick them back up again when we miss out on opportunity. We need to make sure that we're thinking about what we're doing, and let's try to think a little bit more about not leaving to someday to do the things that we should do, to make sure that we're thinking about the responsibilities we have and making sure we use good use of every day to the good cause of the Lord and the help of his people that are here. So I appreciate your attention very much. I hope these things were helpful to you, and there's hopefully things that I will think about more, and hopefully you will as well if you have the mind of a procrastinator. At this time, we do want to offer that invitation we've been speaking of to obey the gospel. We certainly want to encourage you to think about making that decision while time allows, while you have opportunity to do these things, to make sure that you're right with the Lord. If you haven't done that, we encourage you to do that. If there's one here we may help with prayers for no reason, we'd be happy to assist you as well if you'll come forward as you stand and sing the song of invitation.